Before we get started tonight, I'm going to need to update my status, so I need everybody to smile while I take a selfie. Tonight we're going to be talking about selfies. I was on my way to church tonight and I began to reminisce with my wife and Jonah about the first time I ever heard the word selfie used. It was 2 or 3 years ago, and my daughter came home and she was like, you know, so and so they just post too many selfies. And I said, what's a selfie? And then I found out that a selfie was a picture that someone is taking of themselves. As a matter of fact, a lot of the phones today have modified their feature in order to be able to look at yourself in the phone and see the background and to be able to take a selfie. So what is a selfie? A selfie is just a self-portrait of a photograph typically taken with a handheld digital camera or some sort of phone or something of that nature. Now, let me see a show of hands of everybody that's 35 years old or younger that has never taken a selfie. Let me just see a show of hands. All right. Go ahead and stick them up. Well, you only got one elder here tonight there. All right, so you never taken a selfie. Well, you are in a crowd of people that is a rarity. All right, most people that's 35 years and younger have at one time or another taken a selfie. Selfies are often shared with social networking services such as Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook or things of that nature. And they're often casual in nature and typically taken either with the camera with an arm's length away or in a mirror or something of that nature. By the end of 2012, Time magazine considered selfies one of the top 10 buzzwords of the year. By 2013, the word selfie had become commonplace in our society, enough to be monitored by the Oxford English Dictionary Association. And then finally, in November of 2013, the word selfie was announced as being the word of the year by the Oxford English Dictionary, which gave the word itself an Australian origin. A poll commissioned by smartphone and camera makers, Samsung, found that selfies make up about 30% of all photos taken by people aged 18 to 24. I want you to think about that for a second. For those of you who are a little older in the generation, let me share with you a couple selfies. I want you to take a look at this fella in our screen right here. He's running with the bulls over in Spain. And I want you to notice right here, he's decided that he's going to take a selfie of the bulls behind him here. So one of the things that I've seen lately is that people have decided to take pictures in situations that are a little dangerous. This woman takes a picture of a bear in the background. Now most of us would have the inclination to try to leave the scene. This one I thought was pretty cool. This was an astronaut from Japan who was on a space station in outer space, and he decided that he would take a selfie of the surroundings around him, which I thought was fairly neat. And this guy right here, he's just trying to figure it out. He's got a phone in front of the camera, but it's the wrong kind of phone. So we think about this. What's behind the idea or the concept of the selfie phenomenon? It's just a strange phenomenon in which the photographer is also the subject of the photograph in some sort of subversive twist on my traditional understanding of taking a photograph. It's the one who's taking the photograph wants to be the one that's the center of attention. The one taking the picture actually eclipses his surroundings, so to speak. Well, the one taking the picture wants to be the center of the landscape around him. This attempt at photography, or this attempt at photographing ourselves, I should say, as the center of attention anywhere we go, and then posting it is so that everyone knows it's not news. In fact, selfies not only obscure otherwise perfectly good panoramas, but according to Paul, they destroy the potentially good relationship that we can develop among people in Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. I want you to think about this tonight. Christianity is not about selfies. It's not about ourself. The Christianity that God has designed for us is not about fulfilling the desires of individuals, but it's about the concept of being selfless. I want to go back to our text tonight, and I want to try to figure out how we can learn to live selfless among the me generation. I want us to try to figure out the question of how we can live selfless in a selfie world. Now, let me suggest to you first and foremost that as we turn to Philippians, we turn to our text, and this is where the majority of our lesson will come from this evening, Philippians chapter 2. I want to first suggest to you tonight that we can learn to live selfless when we crop out selfish ambition. Now, notice what Paul said here in Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort or love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded and having the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. What the Apostle Paul is telling us here, that in order for us to live selfless, then we're going to have to get rid of selfish ambition. What is selfish ambition? As we look at what the apostle is talking about right here, what exactly is he referring to as selfish ambition? It really means, and if you look at the Greek word, which we'll talk about in just a second, it means to be self-seeking and always looking out for one's own interest. The Greek word that's used for selfish here comes from the word aletheia. And the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle defined it this way. He defined selfish here as selfish ambition, as people who are trying to achieve political office by making themselves look bigger and better before others through trickery. Now think about that for a second. What he was describing is that people or the concept of selfish ambition were those who were trying to make themselves look bigger and better through tricking people, through or causing people to think that they were something that they were not. Paul didn't say, don't be ambitious. Now, I don't want us to take that concept away tonight, that we're not to be people of ambition, that we're not to be motivated. I don't want us to lose sight of what we're talking about here. He didn't say that we should be motivated. What he's talking about is selfishness. Over in Galatians chapter 5, in verse 20, we remember that Paul in that particular context is talking about the sins of the flesh, the works of the flesh. And he talks about idolatry. He talks about lasciviousness. He talks about lust. He talks about all of those sins, and in the midst of those sins is the concept or the sin of selfish ambition. In Romans chapter 2 and verse 8, we read that the wrath of God awaits those who are selfishly ambitious. In James chapter 3 and verse 14 through 16, we read that the wisdom of selfish ambition and the persons who perform that comes from the devil, not from above. He later adds in chapter 4 and verse 1, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires? The idea of desires being ambitions there, do they not come from your ambitions? For pleasure that war in your members. They are established within the selfish ambitions that takes place within the mind of people. James chapter 4 and verse 1. This form of selfishness can be traced back to the beginning of time. I mean, we can turn back to the book of Genesis, and I would encourage you to do so. Turn back to the book of Genesis and take a look at the story of Cain. In Genesis chapter 4, beginning in verse 3, I'm going to the background of this story, we all are familiar with this. Cain was one that had offered up an offering to God. God didn't like it. Yet Abel had offered up an offering to God, and God liked Abel's offering. And this is something that made Cain upset. And as we look at this story, we got to understand, we often talk about the jealousy that takes place of Cain over Abel in this particular passage. But let me tell you something, brethren. Jealousy cannot occur unless there's selfish ambition going on in one's mind. And that's what we read about here in Genesis chapter 4. And pick up the reading there in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 4. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of the flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. But he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?" The idea of our countenance fallen is someone who you can see and recognize in their face that their demeanor has changed, that they become sad, they become angry. And usually someone that's full of selfish ambition, you can see that in their eyes. You can see the jealousy in Cain's eyes here. Notice what the Lord said. He said in verse 7, "If you do well, and you will not be accepted, and you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, and you should rule over it." I'm kind of fascinated with the concept of sin lying at the door here. Because the word sin or lies here, sin lies at the door. The word lies comes from the Hebrew word rebas, which means a resting place. It's associated with the concept of repose or a rest after an exertion. You may say, well, what's that got to do with what we're talking about here? Well, what God is telling Cain here, that sin is in repose. It's just outside of your mind. He's telling Cain, the sin of jealousy, the sin of selfish ambition is just outside of your mind. Don't open the door up and let it inside. Don't give it the opportunity to take control of your mind. You see, if you want to be ambitious about something, the Apostle Paul really gives us some insight of what we can do. He says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we have commanded you. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 in verse 11. If you want to be ambitious about someone, then John gives us some insight in John chapter 15 and verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. We struggle with that, don't we? I mean, I just wonder sometimes if it's just not inherent within us to not struggle with the concept of the American way, of looking out for old number one, putting ourselves first. We struggle with that. We struggle with the fact that we are asked to help someone who can't help us in return. We're asked to give and not expect to receive anything. We struggle with that. I'm kind of reminded of the story I heard that a lady answered the knock at the door one day to find a man with kind of a sad expression on the outside, on his face outside of her door. And he said to her, he said, I'm really sorry to disturb you. He said, but there's I'm collecting money for an unfortunate family in your neighborhood. You see, the husband, he's out of work, and the kids are hungry, and as a matter of fact, the utilities are this close to getting turned off. And what's even more tragic is that if if we don't collect enough money today, then there's a pretty good chance they're going to get evicted from their apartment. And the lady said, well, I hate to hear that. I want to help in any way I can, but let me ask you, before I get involved in this, who are you? And he said, well, I'm the landlord. He's the type of guy that we're talking about that just don't want to get involved in helping someone unless there is a return on his investment. Brethren, we need to crop out all selfish ambition if we're going to learn to live a selfless life as God would have us to live. Turn our Bibles back to Philippians chapter 2 as we look at our next point here in Philippians chapter 2. What Paul describes here as living selflessly. Let me suggest to you this evening how we are going to live a life of selflessness in a selfie world. We've got to learn to filter out conceit. Notice what the apostle says here in verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. Now, as I was putting this letter today, and I'm going to throw you under the bus, I hope you don't mind. As I was putting the sermon together yesterday, I asked Jonah, I said, give me a Bible example of conceit. And he said, what's conceit? Now, he can talk Spanish to you. They learned that all day in school, but vocab, he was missing out on that. But he said, what's conceit? Well, let's talk about that for a moment. What is conceit? Paul said in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 3 that we are to carry one another's burdens. And in this way, in the way that we carry our brothers and sisters' burdens, we fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. You see, what conceit is thinking about ourselves to the point that we don't recognize others' problems. We're so focused on ourselves that we fail to see the problems of other people that are around us. I think a good example of this, of being conceited, is the fact that we are so self-absorbed that we are oblivious to the struggles of even our loved ones to many aspects of this. Turn, if you would, over to 1 Samuel chapter 1. In the book of 1 Samuel chapter 1, we read of Elkanah. And Elkanah was a man in the Old Testament who had two wives. Elkanah's first wife was Peninnah. And the Bible tells us that Peninnah was able to bear children. She had a lot of children. She had all kinds of sons and daughters. But you know what? Elkanah was married to another woman, and her name was Hannah. And the Bible tells us there that Hannah had no children. Verse 2, and he had these two wives, and one of them's name was Hannah, and the other's name was Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now, in the Jewish culture, the fact that a woman did not have children was shameful to her. It was something that was embarrassing. It was embarrassing for her. It was embarrassing for the family. This was something that was very important to the Jewish culture. And so Hannah really, really struggled with this. In verse 4, and whenever the time came, the Bible tells us that Elkanah, he went to make an offering. Now notice the words that it used about Peninnah. It says that he went to make an offering, and he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and all her daughters. She was able to bear a lot of children. This bothered Hannah. But not only did it bother Hannah, there was almost like a rivalry going on among the wives, as verse 6 tells us. And her rival also provoked her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. Oh, I could see what was going on. Girl, you don't want to be pregnant like I am. Whoo! All these kids running around here. Whew. Tell you what, all she was doing was provoking her and making her miserable, according to verse 6. But in verse 8, it began to get to Hannah. It began to bother her to the extent that what verse 8 tells us, then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? What in the world is wrong with you? All you're talking about is children. Look at me. Look what I offer you. Am I not better to you than all these kids that you're thinking about, 10 sons? Here was a person that couldn't get past himself long enough to see the problems of someone else. I'll tell you something. To live selfless, we have to filter out conceit. Bernard Bailey once said that when science discovers the center of the universe, a lot of people will be disappointed to find out they're not it. I believe that. Barry Switzer, the great the great Oklahoma football coach, once said that some people are born on third base and they go through life thinking they hit a triple. This is the type of conceit that we're talking about. Paul put it this way. He said, be of the same mind one to another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinions. Romans chapter 12 and verse 16. Brethren, this is God's way of telling us to get over ourselves. For us to stop thinking about ourselves all the time and to put others first. If we're going to learn to live selfless, we need to filter out deceit in our life, or conceit in our life. If we're going to live selfless in the selfie world today, we're going to have to develop humility. Let's just turn back and look at our text this evening in verse 3. He says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or rivalry or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, in humility, let us esteem each other better than himself. What are you saying, Paul? Well, what Paul is telling us here is don't be the one to push your way to the front. Don't be the one that sweet talks your way to the top. Put yourself and others aside. Put yourself aside and allow others to get ahead. Too many people in our selfie world today are like Ted Turner, who once said, if I had a little humility, then I would just be perfect. The greatest example of humility is found in our text in verses 5 through 9, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But Jesus, having left the glories of heaven to come to this earth, we so need to take on this humble attitude. It's far more impressive. Listen to me, brethren. It's far more impressive when others discover our good qualities without our help. It's far more impressive. The proverb writer said in Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 23 that a man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor. If we're going to live selfless in a selfie world, we're going to have to develop humility. Well, let me suggest to you another point here. If we're going to live selfless in a selfie world, we're going to have to focus on the needs of others. I want to let us give some thought to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4, where the Apostle Paul here says, let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. Don't look out for your own interest, but look out for the interest of others. I want you to think about this. The idea or the concept or the word look in this passage, and that Paul is describing here, it comes from an interesting Greek word that we may recognize. It comes from the word skopos. And where we get that word, where that word is translated into our vernacular today, is the use of the word scope, like what we would put on a rifle. Or the term microscope. Or the term telescope. And what that is describing is it's going to take something that's way off in the distance and it's going to bring it into focus and allow us to see it in the big picture of things. Now, if we can understand that, he says, let us look not only for our own interest, but also the interest of others. Look at the interest of others. Bring the interest of others into the big picture. This means that we care about the lives of people. We pay attention to their needs. In photography, they use a telephoto lens. And what this does, this lens cover brings objects from a great distance into great detail. It enlarges the objects and reduces the landscape around it. It brings us closer for a more intimate inspection. And that's all the apostle is asking us to do as it pertains to the needs of others. Let us look. Let us scope the needs of others. Let us bring it into focus so that we can understand and take an intimate inspection of what it may be. I want you to consider another passage, if you would, over in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. 6 verses 1 and 2. Paul writes to the brethren here at Galatians, he says, brethren, if a man is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Now verse 2, he goes on and he says, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now I'm going to tell you something we can draw from that if we don't bear one another's burdens, we won't fulfill the law of Christ. Well, what's it mean to bear one another's burdens? What's he talking about? What he's talking about here is first that those who have burdens need to be willing to express those burdens. And those of us who are to bear those burdens, we've got to be willing to become involved. And when we bear one another's burdens, we recognize that our brothers and sisters are crushed under the weight of sin. They're crushed under the weight of trials in their life. And so they need some help. Now, let me tell you what bearing burdens in this passage is not. Bearing burdens in this passage is not an opportunity to judge. And what I mean by that is it's not an opportunity for us to examine someone's trials or their burdens and say, well, I don't know what in the world they were thinking. I would have never done that. I would have never made that decision. That's not bearing someone's burdens. It's not an opportunity for us to judge. Let me tell you what else it's not an opportunity for. It's not an opportunity for us to compare. Well, you know, I've done some things in my life, but I got to tell you, it's nothing like what he's talking about. Whew. He's really made a lot of mistakes now. And let me tell you something else. It's not a place for us to satisfy our curiosity. When we bear someone else's burdens, we need not probe every detail of those who are broken. There's a lot of that needs to remain between them and God. I had a brother sit in my kitchen table yesterday for about 2.5 hours. And I got to tell you, up until about 2 or 3 years ago, on the surface, I thought this brother had his act together. But we never know what people's problems are. We never know how broken they are. And I can tell you this much, after listening to his story, the one thing that I can tell you is that I can't fix his broken marriage. I can't fix his brokenness. I can't fix his life. But I'll tell you someone who can. God can. And so, you know what we did is we turned it over to him in prayer at the end of 2.5 hours. And we collectively took it to God. Bear one another's burdens. In World War II, in an Allied bombing raid, there was several of the Allied planes that had just gone off on a bombing raid, and they came back and they told a very interesting story. They said that when they arrived back to their base, that the German anti-aircraft guns were hitting their planes, but the shells were not exploding. And so the technicians began to examine their planes, and they started pulling out some of these shells that had not detonated, and they found out that there was no firing pin in these shells. However, someone had left a note in place of the firing pin, and it was written in the Czech language, and they later found out that it was Jewish slaves that were working in the German artillery. And let me tell you what the note said. The note said, "This is all we can do for now. Wish we could do more." I'm going to tell you something. That's a great example of one who had desperate needs but found a way to focus on the needs of others. Finally, let me share with you tonight that in order for us to live selflessly or selfless in a selfie world, we're going to have to zoom in on the cross. And I want you to notice what the apostle said over in Philippians chapter 2. And I want to pick up our reading there in Philippians chapter 2 in verse 5. The Apostle Paul writes, he said, "Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking on the form of a bondservant, and coming into the likeness of men. And being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross." Think of yourself the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had an equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. He gave it all up, and the Bible says he emptied himself and became a man. Think about verse 5. The mind be in you, which is in Christ Jesus. The word mind, phroneo, come from the Greek there, means attitude. It means our thinking. It's not talking about our brain. We don't need to change anything about our brain. We need to change our mind. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." Robert Murray McShyan said, "It's not great talents that God blesses, but great likeness to Jesus." It's about focusing our minds on the cross of Christ. Well, let me share this with you and then we'll close the lesson. I want to share a passage with you that the Apostle Paul finally realized after obeying the gospel. It wasn't about yourself anymore. This is almost like the epiphany the Apostle Paul had in obeying the gospel in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. He says, "For I have been crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." In order to live selfless, we're going to have to zoom in on the cross of Calvary. And maybe you need to do that tonight. Maybe there's time that you need to zoom in on the cross of Calvary. You need to recognize that Jesus' blood at Calvary, the blood that he shed at Calvary, can only be accessed. It can only be accessed through obedience. Through giving your life in the form of obedience. Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Take my yoke. Yes, he said, take my yoke. There is a yoke. There is a burden to being a Christian. There is a burden to turning your life over to the Lord. But notice what he said about it. "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." there's a struggle. There's trials. There's tribulations involved in bearing the yoke of Christ. But he said it's easy. His burden is light. Put on him in baptism this very night. Be raised to walk that new life. Maybe you've done that. You've turned your back on the Lord. And you want to make things right. You want the brethren here to bear your burden with you. That's what they're here for. That's what our brothers and sisters do. That's what love generates and causes us to be responsive to do. Why don't you come right now, while together we stand and while we